Hello, Mage fans, and welcome to Mage the podcast where we work hard towards Ascension so you don't have to. I'm your host, Adam Simpson. I'm joined by Terry Robinson, and today on Tomes of Magic, we are going to be giving you a manifestation of a manifesto. We are looking at Manifesto, Transmissions from the Rogue Council. I mean, just the name of that gets me stirred up. Manifestos, wild-eyed ranting. It just makes me want to launch into a rant myself, but Terry's shaking his head, and I'm not going to launch into a rant. Okay, well, that's enough of that then. This book came out in 2002. It is actually the last Mage book of 2002. It clocks in at 94 pages. Terry and I were discussing before the show that this may be the second shortest book of revised edition, but in my opinion, it packs a punch, and I have no problem with the short length. The authors on this were Angel McCoy and Malcolm Shepard, and this book is the first book where Bill Bridges is listed as the sole developer, and Bill Bridges will continue to be the sole developer of Revised Edition until we get to 2004 and the book titled Ascension. So in this book, we're going to see what Bill Bridges would like to do with Mage. So I'm going to ask Terry now to give us a walkthrough, and let's see what we're dealing with here.
This book starts a kind of a short section of books where the introductory fiction is a little bit longer, and it rotates between a number of point of view characters where somebody has been given a bit of information dropped in a mysterious package to be at a particular place at a particular time. And this drop occurs between both a set of traditionalists, seemingly, and a set of technocrats. And part of what happens through here is kind of a post-mortem where the technocrats are like, look at this amazing thing we did. And then this mysterious figure within the technocracy is like, you think you did the good thing? And they're like, yeah, well, actually, you didn't do the good thing. You did the not good thing. And the other technocrat is like, why have to be such a jerk about it? Jeez, we're just doing our darn jobs. And that's kind of the introductory fiction. It gets a number of callbacks throughout the rest of the text, which I thought was kind of interesting. Normally, introductory fiction is not that interesting to me, but the fact that it kept coming back up, I thought was kind of neat.
I thought it was fine. I mean, it didn't really tip me off as being exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. I thought it was interesting. I'm not sure if it needed to be quite that long, but what's interesting for me is how they use it in callbacks through the rest of the book. I think what they're trying to do is drop a subtle hint and say, oh, this new force at work in the world of Mage, you think it's doing something good, but maybe it isn't. Yeah. But then that might just be the interpretation I'm bringing to the table.
Then we move into the introduction, which, again, is a simple 4 pages explaining what the rest of the book is going to be about. And I try to be generous with most Mage books. 1, because we're Mage people. 2, because writing books are hard. But one of the things that I have slowly become more critical of are introductions where the rest of the book does not deliver on the promise of what was outlined in the introduction. What we get so far is that the Masters have opted out of the Ascension War. Even those who have not been destroyed by the events of the Avatar Storm are, for various reasons, opting out of tradition politics. And this is the first time I recall a book explicitly saying not only is it just the fact that the Avatar Storm has happened, but that Masters, to a T, have by and large stepped back. Later on, it gives us a whole bunch of examples of Masters who have not stepped back, which is one of the annoyances that I had, but it says that this has kind of been occurring across the board. The other thing that it makes a mention of is that it's not the Technocracy's fault that they won the Ascension War. It's the Sleepers' fault that they became apathetic. And then it says, whose fault is it that they became apathetic? The answer is the Technocracy. So I'm going to say it's the Technocracy's fault. It reframes the argument between the traditions and the Technocracy as one of liberty versus control. This is a subtle reframing of this conflict because one of the things that occurred earlier in Revised is the idea of there is a notion of liberty versus flourishing, and the traditions believe that you can maximize both. Here, it reduces it back down to a very simple control versus freedom question. It also mentions that the Rogue Council has appeared that it claims descent from the previous council, that messages are coming out of nowhere from it. It is a stirring call to arms. And the book kind of says, we're not going to tell you what's actually going on. And you're like, well, that's okay, as long as you give me a bunch of options, which to me is way better than the, here's a mysterious rumor that could be true. I much prefer, here's a thing, it's a mystery. We're not going to tell you what the mystery is, but here are 3 options. And I'm like, oh, okay, that I can run with. And that's the introduction.
Yeah, this introduction, even though it was only 3 pages or so, it really packs a punch. I took a lot of notes. I'm not going to go into them now for interest of time, but yeah, this is really where it made it clear that the same things happened in the world of Mage, but we are offering a different perspective on that. And for me, that was very interesting. I was carefully reading through this intro and thinking, yeah, this is something that I am really enjoying.
Chapter 1 is entitled The Beginning or the End, which made me throw up a little bit because I hate that title as a kind of a device. But it gives you some notes on kind of what do the activities of the Rogue Council look like. Again, it says the Earthbound Masters have stepped down, except for the ones who didn't, that apathy and pessimism have spread among the awakened, that chantries have pulled inwards and are less places of discovery and more fortresses, that traditionalist chantries in a lot of cases have become cloisters and so on. But now that that has happened, some new notes and bits of information have appeared around the awakened world, and they have a few common threads going through them. The sources seem to be very knowledgeable about what members of the Cabal and what other awakened forces are doing. It provides information about plots and events that are happening in the awakened world amongst what it considers kind of to be the enemies of Ascension. These objects can't be traced and seemingly lack resonance. They are signed with a Sphinx of some sort. They have been sent to all traditions. They have 2 recurring phrases that keep popping up, and that the messages tend to be on the cryptic side, and that they are often subtle or coincidental in the way that they appear. It outlines that each of the traditions seemingly has a different response on the eve of this. It gives a rundown on a tradition by tradition basis, which is fine. It's like the Euthanatoi are particularly interested in this, and you're like, why? I would have liked a little bit more information on the politics kind of underlying it. I think it kind of let me down there. But the recurring phrases we get is, Enigma takes you where dogma cannot, and we do not create the path to ascension, we explore it. And these are good rhetorical phrases. The second one I think is interesting. We do not create the path to ascension, we explore it, because I feel like that goes against kind of the postmodern, we forge our own truth that is kind of baked into Mage, but I can run with it. We then get a whole bunch of example missives that have been marked with this Sphinx logo, and we get a handful of pages where it just goes through example transmissions. In some cases, it looks like a fake movie reel. In other cases, it is simply a letter. In some cases, it has been pictures or cryptic emails, and that the information being passed on seems to go to a wide number of tradition members and a wide number of agents. And that has been kind of interesting. And that rounds out the chapter. We get another moment where there's a flashback where the technocrat looking over the footage from the raid in the introduction is like, why did this guy shoot this guy? I don't know about you. After about the 3rd time that was brought up, I'm like, why did that guy shoot that guy? I really hope I get closure on this. But it's a Mage book, so no one ever gets closure on anything. So what did you think of chapter 1?
We'll try to bring closure for you, Terry, after this recording. You. But for now, I thought it was very interesting in chapter 1 on page 23, a quote, "A feeling of hopelessness has spread through the awakened, making politics seem pointless and petty," end quote. And of course, this disagrees pretty directly with what we find in The Bitter Road, which said that a feeling of hope and new direction has come to the awakened and that they're active in politics now. I don't think this was just naysaying what came before. I think this book gives reasons why this statement makes sense from a different perspective. And again, we have a different developer now bringing a different perspective. And so I thought this was very interesting. This actually made me look at Revised in a new way, and one that helped me with several points. There's a different perspective on the post-Avatar Storm situation. For example, The Bitter Road really praised this idea that mages were becoming more self-focused. Instead of a larger goal, I'm getting my own life together, and isn't that great that I'm free to do that now? And this book takes a different point of view. It's saying, no, it's actually not good to be so self-focused. It's good to pay attention to what's happening in the larger world. So that came through for me in chapter 1, and was quite interesting for me to see. But I'm ready for chapter 2.
Chapter 2 is entitled The Sphinx's Riddle, and it outlines more or less what it says on the tin. It says, hey, so there's this Sphinx. What's up with that? Which is always really weird to encounter from, like, the book author, and sometimes you just want to go, like, I don't know, you tell me. And it goes over the symbolism of the Sphinx and various cultures that have had a Sphinx or a Sphinx-like entity. A number of cultures around the Levant and the Maghreb have had some sort of Sphinx entity, which is a generally a mythical creature that is chimerical in some way, that is a combination of features between animals. It may be the head of a human or a falcon or a cat or a sheep or a lion or what have you. It is similar to a manticore or a lamassu or a narasima. There's a bunch, but the base is generally a lion, except when it's not. And it goes over a bunch of possible connections to the Sphinx. This really felt like they kind of needed to fill word count. Where it's just like, hey, here's a whole bunch of historical information. And they go over the Egyptian connection to it, with the Sphinx represented, how it appeared to the Greeks. A slightly different Egyptian connection where they talk about a possible awakened theory of the Egyptian Sphinx. And maybe this thing is way older, and they kind of trace it back to it being roughly 12,000 years old. And some change. They talk about the Orion theory, that it is indeed much older and is pointing towards a particular constellation, that there is a yet another connection in Galilee where there are a number of carvings that show something that's like a Sphinx that's almost as old. And then it gives us a second Greek connection. It also makes vague references to what appears to be the red sign, KX76, which is this thing that is hanging out near Neptune and is about to pass through the zodiac sign of Aquarius. And it's like, could this be another coincidence? I'm like, you tell me. You're literally writing this. It gives a few other options, and it says, and then almost as if someone is reading my mind, it says, dealing with player frustration. This mystery may be frustrating. I'm like, no kidding. How about that? So I appreciated that they just kind of came out and mentioned it. And then they talk about what appears to be the unifying themes of the Sphinx. And first they mention that it is cross-tradition, that it mentions that all roads lead to Rome, or so it is said, and that just felt like a non sequitur. And they talk about how the Sphinx is anti-dogmatic and in favor of unification. But if the Sphinx is working across traditions and is in favor of unification and giving out bits of information to encourage that and so on, that kind of sounds like a dogma. Just putting that one out there. You can become quite dogmatic in the pursuit of avoiding dogma. We get another bit where Mr. Metropolis is trying to figure out why this person got shot during this technocratic raid. And then we get a speculation section. And the speculation section is interesting. It comes up with a whole bunch of cases where, what could this thing be? It gives you arguments against it. It gives you support in favor of it. And it gives you rumored variants. And the examples they gave was that this is the Council of the Nine that has been reformed in some way, and they're on the down low. This is a new rogue council. Another one is that it is a universal unconsciousness, almost in the same way that control is made up of the thoughts and beliefs and desires of all high-level technocrats, that this is similar to it, but for the traditions, that it is a side effect maybe of the Avatar Storm, or that it's a trap. And every time it mentioned that, I could only think of Admiral Akbar. And
me too.
Yeah. It's a trap. That would be great if we had that in canon. It goes over some of the followers and the opponents of the Sphinx, basically saying that there is a group of tepid supporters, enthusiastic supporters, and fanatical supporters, as well as a group of tepid opponents, enthusiastic opponents, and fanatical opponents. And you're like, that kind of makes sense.
I had a different take on chapter 2. Rather than feeling like they were filling word count, this was actually my favorite chapter of the book. This is the chapter that got me excited about the book. First off, Terry mentioned a few minutes ago the Orion theory about how the pyramids were placed, built certain ways and placed in certain places because of star constellations and a connection. If you would like to see some more information on that is very mage related, then Anders Sandberg, years before this book was written, had typed out material on the very same topic. His Egypt Chronicle, I have preserved that on the Anders Mage page 2.0. We will put a link in the show notes for you. Anders Sandberg goes into detail and lays out a whole setting and possible chronicle around that for people who have an interest in that idea. This chapter motivated me to want... it motivated me and made me want to work with the Rogue Council. It said not only is this a mysterious group of mages passing information, and they seem to be pro-Council of Nine, but they use this Sphinx emblem, and whether it actually is a Sphinx, like a bygone in Mage, or it's just a logo, is left up to the storytellers. Some Mage fans are going to think of the Sphinx that is mentioned in both digital web books. I don't think the authors of this book intended us to make a connection between those two figures, but of course you could in your own chronicle if you wanted to. It's just so many different theories about these are what Sphinxes have been like in different cultures and what they mean and what they're usually trying to accomplish and how they usually operate, and this is how you could draw connections to what the Rogue Council is currently doing in Mage. But these sort of big, historical, mystical conspiracies come out, and I think that is so appropriate because the Rogue Council basically is a conspiracy. It's a group of people who have some access to powerful magic. They're pulling strings and they're keeping their faces hidden. And so, yeah, this really is conspiracy material. So making connections to other possible mystical and ancient world conspiracies, I think, is appropriate. And it was so interesting to me that, again, it motivated me to want to use this book if I'm running Revised Edition. I saw advice and examples for storytellers on how to write their own messages from their Rogue Council to their players in their own games. And that's what made it interesting to me. There's really practical nuts and bolts kind of information here. It is not just, hey, wouldn't it be interesting if you as a storyteller used Rogue Council to do some things in your games? It's like, here, we're going to give you examples of their messages. We're going to give you guidelines and bullet points on what is and is not in the messages so that when it comes time for you to actually, type out a message and print it and put it on the table for your players and say that it's an email or a letter in the mail, etc., we'll give you some pointers. This is how you can kind of do it. And of course, if you want to do it different, fine. But it's nice to have that guidance for a storyteller who's thinking, oh, well, that was a fun book, but now what do I do now that I'm running my own game? So very practical. And I just really enjoyed it. I really liked this chapter. This chapter opened it up and said, hey, we're not just looking at modern day Western people in modern day Western cities. That's how I like to look at Mage. I like to bring things like that into Mage. So on to chapter 3.
So chapter 3. Chapter 3 is where I felt the book really started firing, and this is entitled A Plague of Sphinxes, which I really hope is the collective noun for sphinxes. They'd be like, yes, an army of ants or a crash of rhinos, a plague of sphinxes. It mentions that one of the things that you can do with the Sphinx is use it as a way to give basic information about the awakened world. And I'm like, oh man, that is great. It's a get out of jail free card for a storyteller that needs to give information to their players. And anytime I can just have in-world exposition done for me gracefully, I will take it. And it breaks up the Sphinx revelations into a number of steps. First is dissemination, that the Sphinx starts by sending out questions. Why did the traditions obey the Primi? Why should the traditions judge each other, or why did they come to? And these messages come from all over the place. And it mentions that in the process of doing this, it mentions it a little bit later, that the Technocracy frontline agents start picking up on this and start asking questions too. And I liked this idea of there more or less being a new awakened faction that is kind of stirring the pot slightly, and it talks later about the problems that it comes up with that. But in the second phase, entitled Warnings and Blessings, we get council lore being disseminated, announcements of new threats, only a handful of facts are given, and the rest needs to be uncovered by the people receiving it. And one type of clue is just that the characters may receive a crazy amount of detail on something that otherwise no one should have information on, or evidence of a technocratic crime. This lasts for several months and kind of proves that there's a bunch of information. If the players don't bite on that, we have phase 3, which is testimonials, where about 6 months in, stories abound of people who've produced results by following the advice of the Rogue Council or messages marked with the Sphinx. That there are a number of camps that start to emerge, believing in or opposing it, the emissaries who support the Rogue Council and the Guardians who generally oppose it tend to occur more. Curtamane is mentioned as happening with a certain degree of frequency, and I always roll my eyes a little bit at that. And that enters phase 4, fading frequency. And the idea here is fewer messages are given out. And the question then becomes, is that because that's all the Sphinx needs to do and it's gotten everyone good and riled up? Or has something interceded and started to attack the functional basis of what the Rogue Council is doing? It gives the basic factions, the emissaries who are generally in favor of the Rogue Council, the Guardians who oppose it, and the fencers or fence-sitters. This was interesting because I didn't realize it at the time, but this is 2002 and is coming out on the eve of the U.S. entering the Iraq War. And I kind of had I don't know if it was intended or just kind of an artifact of the timing, where I'm like, oh yeah, this kind of reminds me of the conversations I had with my friends on what we should be doing geopolitically at the time. We also get a copy of the Rogue Council Manifesto, which basically says the Council of the Nine Mystic Traditions should be about ascension. It should be about pushing people along the path of thorns, that there are many ways to pursue this, and that we are going to take the fight to the enemies of ascension and their collaborators. So this is a shot against the Technocracy, the Nefandi, Infernalists, and other heralds of Armageddons. And it just kind of as an aside is like, the Marauders shall be barred from harming humanity. I'm like, good luck convincing them of that one, buddy. I don't know. That's like writing a sign. That's like writing a sign that says no barking and then showing it to your dog and being like, hey, buddy, read the sign. And the dog just kind of tilts their head at you. We get the technocratic response, which is in the form of a new organization that pops up that we get a little bit more information about later, called Panopticon, which I loved. And we get some complications that start popping up because of this. The Technocracy starts having questions internally, that it mentions that there are agents within the Technocracy that say, if we're so great, why do we need to be actively suppressing reality deviance? Shouldn't our thoughts and beliefs just win in the marketplace of ideas? Given the option between the safe path of science and whatever the heck the Hermetics are doing, for instance, shouldn't we just win? And I very much liked the idea that maybe there are technocrats who think that violence is not the correct way of doing it. That they mentioned that if you need cyborgs and monsters to win your case, maybe your argument isn't that great. That also the fact that traditions are starting to enact the commands of the Rogue Council and attack the Technocracy again is causing old command structures to kind of shake up and occur again. That while the pogrom was at a very low level, then the clear chain of command that was present in the Technocracy previously isn't that necessary. And it reiterates once again that the Technocracy stands for control and the traditions hopefully stand for freedom. We get a few complications that could occur. It kind of asks for your group to be willing to suspend disbelief in the whole like untraceability, no one being able to figure anything out, and that after a little bit that these transitions may be faked, that people may start using it to keep advantage of it, that alliances between the conventions and the traditions to deal with common enemies may start becoming more tense. Are the deals that the council has made with other groups worth the price? I would have liked more information on those, just because we don't have a lot of examples of those in Mage, and that kind of rounds out chapter 3.
Well, I thought it was interesting how the Rogue Council can add structure to a Mage Chronicle. Those who remember back to the early days of first edition, chantries were supposed to provide that structure. It was the place where the mages lived, and they had mentors and chantry leaders who could assign missions. A lot of role players call this the quest giver, as a sort of generic term. They can be given information about what's going on in the world from other mages they pass in the hall at the Chantry. Chantries in the early days of Mage gave a storyteller a way to put a lot of structure into their game if they wanted to make use of that. And so now we're in Revised Edition. Chantries still exist, of course, but now they are really quite different. They are much smaller. They're on Earth itself. They have younger, less influential mages there. There's much less. It's harder to add structure with this, but with the Rogue Council you can assign missions, or you can give an enemy that they fight, story after story. And so it's interesting how a storyteller can use the Rogue Council to add structure if that's how they want to use them. It mentions the 4 phases of the Rogue Council's activity, and that is, in the beginning, Rogue Council messages are like this, and then as time passes, we get to phase 2, and now the messages change a bit like this, the content of the messages and their frequency, etc. We go through 4 different phases, and this is for storytellers to make use of if they want a chronicle that focuses on the Rogue Council. If you're using Rogue Council as sort of an extra thing going on in the background, then the 4 phases is probably just needless complication. But it's interesting how they provided that tool. I think that is helpful. And page 55 gives us how to identify fake transmissions. And I thought that was very clever. The people writing the book were paying good attention to their subject. And that is, once the Rogue Council starts putting out messages in the world of Mage, well, they're hiding their faces, they're hiding their identities. So this is practically begging, other people who are not in the Rogue Council, to fake messages from the Rogue Council to push their own agendas. And so this is sort of an aid for storytellers to kind of help work with the players. It's like, hey, maybe that's not a real transmission from the Rogue Council. How do you tell the real ones from the fake ones? And so the storyteller can either help the players to reach that conclusion, or simply use that to answer questions from the players. Well, I noticed this. Is that important? So helpful, practical tools for a storyteller to run with the Rogue Council, and I certainly appreciated that.
Chapter 4 is entitled Anarchy and Authority, and we get a sample cabal, Jupiter's Forge, who are a group of emissaries, people who are generally in favor of following the messages of the Sphinx and the directives of this Rogue Council. We get a number of relatively detailed character sheets outlining some of the characters, and it presents some bitter Ascension warriors, which I liked. It is not a case where it is strictly people talking about internal politics and so on. It gives us other members. It does the thing where it gives us a few incredibly detailed characters, and then a few these people also exist, which I appreciate. Anytime I get a fully fleshed out character that I can drop into a story, even if I've changed their agenda, I certainly appreciate it. We get a section on the Technocracy response outlining a new organization called Panopticon, which is a cross-convention group that combines Iteration X, Biomechanics Works, NWO operatives, the Progenitors, Damage Control, the Void Engineers, Border Quarter Vision, to form kind of elite enlightened soldiers that protect the conventions against this sudden uptick in activity. I liked this because it reiterated an idea that floated around a bunch previously of basically the Technocracy saying, you say that we're violent, we try to stamp out the traditionalists, but they blow up our stuff. I think our response is reasonable. And here we have another example of it, of, well, the Technocracy wasn't really doing much. It was kind of keeping to its own until the traditionalists started raising Cain again. And okay, I guess we have to get violent again if we're going to protect our stuff. And I thought it was a reasonable, measured response, as it were, at least within the confines of the Technocracy and the game Mates the Ascension. We get the idea that Panopticon has its own ranks and titles and so on, that over the course of time, it will slowly get recognized by the rest of the Technocracy as a force to be reckoned with. It does a callback to the rank background that is brought up in Bitter Road. It mentions that if you're doing a Technocracy game involving it, it should take a little bit before people will start listening to them. And I thought that made perfect sense. It brings up Panopticon Task Force Asia Pacific 3, the Jesuits, and it talks about the characters that are participating in that. I like the fact that we got Chains coming back from Progenitors. So from the first Technocracy book, a kind of appearance-changing character who had a penchant for violence is now a member of Panopticon. It's good to see a person from your hometown making good. We get another character who is, I think, a fascinating character who has their own set of doubts but views Buddhism kind of as the truth, and that deviants need to be shown the errors of their way through peaceful dialogue, that his dharma is to fulfill his inner genius for psychological manipulation. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's an interesting thing to want to be the best at, but I guess that's a choice. And that kind of closes out the chapter. What'd you think of chapter 4, Anarchy and Authority?
This is another strong chapter for me. There are a lot of sample NPCs, so this could be seen as like a quick start for a storyteller. And although they're tailored towards a game that focuses on the Rogue Council, these NPCs work great anywhere. So yeah, I really liked these examples. Also, they were good examples of mages in revised edition. So it was appropriate, and I really liked what they offered. I'm going to say page 63, hit marks are back, baby. They are back on the menu. They are no longer clunky and uncool. They are dangerous, and they are in the field. So I just like that. I think hit marks are pretty darn cool. I don't use them in every game, of course, but I like to bring them in every once in a while and give a psychological punch to them. So I just think it's fun to bring them back. I think the sample Panopticon group is very useful as either quick start player characters or as opponents for your players. I mean, either way, I like this gathering, and I really like the presentation of Panopticon as being a cross-convention group. I think for me, a lot of the strengths of the Technocracy come out when you focus not on 5 different groups who are hating each other and fighting for supremacy. It's 5 different groups who work together well and get things done and are not trying to kill each other all the time. And so I like how Panopticon takes in members from, in this case, 4 different conventions. The Syndicate funds it and doesn't send any other people, but basically, I like this view of the Technocracy. So yeah, bravo for Chapter 4.
Where's the Syndicate representative? And it's just like a person in a business suit, but it's a scarecrow that just like stuffed with 20s and being like, oh, okay, got it. It's like a piñata of money. Chapter 5 is entitled Alien Avatar, and this is an honest-to-goodness adventure. And I think that brings the total number of adventures we have in Mage to, like, 3. Across 80 books at this point. We get, like, our 3rd one. And it does something that I appreciate that Malcolm Shepard and Bill Bridges seemingly have no difficulty doing, and that is just adding things to the Mage canon where they think it makes sense. And this gives you an opportunity for you to use the phrase technocracy Nazi gold. So I'm certainly in favor of it. Not any of those parts individually, but as an adventure concept. And it brings up the idea that at the close of World War II, something started by the name of Operation Sparkmaker, which was a program by the Technocracy to basically be like, so those Nazis, did they figure out anything? If the answer is yes, we want it. We get our first kind of Technocracy Nazi war criminal who is like, okay, we will look the other way, assuming that you come and do work for us. That the phenomenon of the Avatar Storm had occurred in another place, that you had this collection of information called the Black Papers about it, and then the idea of the Folterbrunnen, which was the, what did it translate to? The torture fountain. Yeah, a bit on the nose. That there was this area where if people went through the gauntlet there, they were kind of torn to shreds. And so when the Avatar Storm starts happening, there is a very, very small number of people who are like, oh, okay, we've dealt with this before. And in the process, they have tried to create alien-human hybrids, trying to take control of it. That the Anakim, these entities that are a little bit different, that are viewed as having alien psychic gifts, or that the Verbena would call fetch marks, exist within the population and have some ability to manipulate this phenomenon. I thought that was interesting background. Like, even if you don't use the rest of the adventure, it gives you weird mage secret history that you can just kind of pepper in that makes mortal history a little bit different. It doesn't suggest that the Technocracy caused World War II or anything like that, but it does give you an idea of maybe some of the complications that occurred in Awakened Society alongside Mortal Society, and it also gives you a few options to explain the Storm Warden merit that appears in Revised, where a character can be unaffected by the avatar storm. It then goes into the adventure itself. In Act 1, you are basically trying to track down a character who was engaged in Situation 6, which was the best known of the Tradition plus Technocracy groups that acted during the close of World War II. It appeared that by 1946 it was completely disbanded, that it was partially responsible for the set of hearings and so on that were done at the close, kind of the awakened version of the Nuremberg trials, at which 34 people were killed for crimes against Ascension and 9 more were gilghouled. That there's a character by the name of Nineman who knew what happened during Operation Sparkmaker and was kind of disgusted by it, but this is a character that's done their time with the Technocracy and has just been laying low for the last 50 years, but is surprisingly spry. It then says this is how you track down this person after your group has gotten some bit of information. And then it goes into Act 2, where you investigate a Technocracy base in the Arctic. It ultimately turns out that there is some sort of entity being held there that the Technocracy is trying to research, that one of the last of the Nazi scientist war criminals is active there and kind of gets their own comeuppance depending on how things end. We get a map of an Arctic research base. We get information on how to do this, what the magic of the area is like, and the adventure itself seemed pretty deadly, but it gives you a lot of tools to play with. Like it says, hey, if you want to play out what it's like being in the Arctic, here's some considerations for systems. I think, though, hands down, my favorite part is on page 76, there's a section called Did You Say 40 Soldiers? Where it makes mention that the CFS Vigilant, this Canadian base, is guarded by 40 soldiers. And it's like, here's how you deal with 40 soldiers as a mage. And I super like this because this should be in the core rulebook. This should be like, hey, this is how mages do stuff. And I really like that as an idea where it's like, hey, you're immortal. You may have allies. Maybe you use stealth. Maybe you train a whole bunch. Maybe you just nuke the thing from orbit or take advantage of combat wonders or something like that and go in armed from the teeth. Or you take it real slow and just knock people out one by one using mind and entropy effects or something like that. And I'm like, this is pretty good. That's interesting. It's a real magic-y way of dealing with things. There's a lot of correspondence and time bans and wards that prevent people from peeking around and just hopping in, grabbing the plot device, and then leaving, which I both understand and makes me roll my eyes. And then ultimately we get information about a character that appears to be some sort of human-alien hybrid by the name of Peter Wu, who is one of the Anakim, one of these creatures that has merged with what may be one of the psychopomps. And it suggests that the entities that were responsible for mages being unified with their avatars were kicked out of reality kind of as punishment for showing humans how to deal with the restrictions placed on them by more or less God or the gods or something. And I thought that was interesting in that it's like, hey, here's a justification for the psychopomps. Here's an explanation of maybe what the Avatar Storm is. Here's why the psychopomps seemingly went away. And here's where things stand now. We don't get a huge amount of information beyond in the rest of Revised, but I thought it was pretty solid in that regard, that the psychopomps are helping to guide mages navigate the strictures of the world created by whoever came up with it and are being punished for doing so, and we're kind of banished beyond the realms of the Celestines. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. It was very interesting. There was a lot here to appeal to mage fans, and so yeah, I'm certainly glad they had this in here. There are very few adventures for mage, and most of those are in the first 2 editions of mage. In fact, yeah, probably all of them, even more in first edition, really. At the beginning of this game line, they were tossing out a few adventure ideas, and as time went on, they just did less and less and less and less. Now we have a long dry spell, and when I talked about adventures previously for this podcast, I left this one out because it is so tightly connected to what's going on in the metaplot in Revised Edition that to even talk about it, I would have to get into the whole metaplot. And so at this point in the podcast, we have gotten into the weeds. We have talked about it. And so this is a great time for us to discuss this adventure. I liked it because it's high action. They even say in the book, a lot of people by now have the impression that Mage is about navel gazing and talking things out, but high action can be just as much a part of Mage as anything else. And we, dove headfirst into it for this adventure. And it's like, yeah, cool. I'm totally on board with that. The adventures that we got in the past were sort of a mix of action and low key sorts of things. But I certainly enjoyed having that here.
It's cerebral. It's cerebral in the way that headbutting someone is cerebral.
I guess so. Yeah. One way to put it. On page 70, it was interesting for me to note that we are about more than halfway through a revised edition. And now finally we're doing something interesting and directly involved with the Avatar Storm. We're not just saying that it is there and it changes everything, but we have a story that really gets into the details of it, how it works, why it works, what you can do with it, how you can get around it, what it might mean to other things. I really like that. We get the psychopomps, also called the fetches. They are a special kind of entity that can move back and forth and has a special relationship with the Avatar Storm. And this makes me more likely to use the Avatar Storm in a chronicle that I'm running. Now, it connects to something. Now it means something for me. And so I really appreciated that. This adventure is very loosely structured, and for me it's very interesting to contrast that with Loom of Fate, which is a whole book adventure from earlier first edition. Loom of Fate, I think was a good adventure. I liked it, and I want to run it for some players sometime, but it was quite different from this. It was very, very carefully structured. There are a number of different scenes, and the scenes are not laid out in any given order. They can link to each other in any sequence, but you very much focus on the scene. In this scene, we're going to have something like this, and here are 3 or 4 possible outcomes that will propel us to another scene. So in a way, you could say it was more carefully structured, but not in any way that's constricting to a storyteller. This, however, is very loosely structured. It says, here are some important people, and here's some information on them. Here are some important locations where important things are going on. Here's good information on those. Now, the sequence in which this happens, the details, how long you spend there, that is really totally up to the storyteller. And this meshes well with advice that we got from Mage developers in past Mage books saying, hey, look, it is really hard to write published Mage adventures because mages can do almost anything. Sphere magic is really powerful and really flexible. And so to script out a series of scenes that connect in order is probably not a good idea for those of you who want to run Mage stories. And this adventure really makes good on that advice. It says, look, you need to go talk to this mage. He's in San Francisco. He's going to give you important information to continue with the story. But hey, maybe you won't talk to him. Maybe your players will find a reason that they don't even want to go to San Francisco. Okay, here's another way to pass them the information that they need from San Francisco in that one NPC so that you can proceed to the next part of the adventure. And there's 2 acts, there's 2 areas of this adventure. And one is San Francisco. And like I said, you don't have to take your players to San Francisco. There's not a lot of information on the city of San Francisco and what's going on there. And reading through this adventure, someone who doesn't have a lot of experience as a storyteller might get the impression that, oh, they're supposed to quickly go to San Francisco, get a little information, and then move on. Actually, you can do all kinds of things in San Francisco. You can do this any way you want, make it take as long as you want, put in seeds for future stories, etc. And then when we get to the Canadian military base up in the Arctic, then there's a lot of information on who is there, what the defenses are, what they can find. There's a map of the different buildings. So you can do this well. But again, if you're going to spend a little time or a lot of time, make it low-key or lots of explosions and action, you can do this any way you want. So it's very loosely structured, which I think is a great way for new storytellers who are new to Mage to write their own first adventures for their own players. I think this is a good guide. Take a look at this and take to heart its method, which is a few important people, a few important places, some things connected to that, and from there, let the story flow in any way that you want it to. We get some good stats for sleeper soldiers, that is regular humans who have no magical or supernatural abilities. Their weapons, their skills, their stats, very useful. I think this should be in like the Storyteller's Guidebook or something. And also on page 93, we get the Anakim, which are a special sort of creature that do not fit into any of the existing factions in the world of Mage. I kind of see it as Umbrood coming into the world, mixing with people, and they're using that to advance their agenda, which is they want to bring in more of their buddies and take over the physical world if they can manage it. And I really like that. I like seeing new kinds of beings, new kinds of agendas and groups in the world of darkness that don't connect to the mage factions that we know. So, yeah, I really liked Chapter 5.
What did you think about the book overall?
I think this was a big shakeup for Revised Edition, but I think it was done in a good way. You know, everyone's going to have their own opinions on this, but Heinig's view of the world of Mage focused very much on personal impact, intimate, small-scale stories, which is great if you enjoy that. It's not so much my thing, at least not that often. And so I appreciated this focus on the world stage, global conspiracies, more action, more going on. We just finished the Mage Storyteller's Handbook, which specifically said at one point, a cranky landlord is a great opponent for your players for social interactions. And I was thinking, well, yeah, but I'd rather have a bad guy who's trying to take over the world and setting off city-destroying explosions or something like that. It's like, I like my action, and this book delivers. I think this is a new presentation of the post-Avatar Storm situation. And for me, it's more reasonable. I think Heinig had a certain vibe he was going for when he put out Bitter Road. He saw a lot of possibilities in his ideas, and I guess that's great. But there were a lot of details he gave of what the world is like after the Avatar Storm that didn't really make so much sense for me. I couldn't really see how the piece held together well. And this different take on things just worked so much better for me. It's like, look, mages are keeping to their own. They're worried about what's going on, but a lot of people see this as losing hope or being selfish. And, that's going to have effects on things and make people, change their motivations in certain ways. And so I really like that. I really like the Rogue Council. If I am going to run a Mage Chronicle that makes use of the meta plot of Revised Edition, I will definitely have the Rogue Council in it. For me, it is a linchpin that holds everything else together and makes it interesting. So, for me, this is an important book for Revised Edition. I wouldn't game without it. This is a very storyteller-facing book. This is not like so many of the fantasy role-playing adventures where it's like, if your players read this, everything is ruined. No, it's not like that. But still, this is a book that is written to appeal to storytellers a lot. It gives them practical tools, it gives them advice, it gives them structure, it gives them so many things. And so finishing this, it's like, I actually would have understood if they put the word storyteller into the title of this book, because that really is the focus. I believe that young mages, just like young people, like to have large goals. They like to focus on making a difference in the world rather than getting their own life together or getting their own self advanced to a better position in life. And so it really made sense to me where a couple of places in this book it said, look, there's a lot of young mages that are disheartened. They're told, get your own act together and maybe you can be a great person in the future. And that's bumming them out. And the Rogue Council is really appealing to them, saying, hey, you can do big, important things now because that's what we need. It motivates young people. It makes them want to be a part of something bigger. And so that message in this book was very meaningful for me. I think that's a reasonable way to present the events of the post-Avatar Storm world. And one thing that occurred to me, a very interesting idea, is the books before this in Revised Edition say that now that the Avatar Storm is over and we're not fighting the Technocracy anymore and we're focusing on our own things, everybody's hopeful and happy and everything is going great. It's like, well, what if you said that the young mages who secured positions of leadership in the new Council of Nine, what if that was a message that they were pushing on purpose to try to justify their new position in the new situation that they have created themselves? Now that becomes a very interesting idea for me. That's something I might want to interact with. There are people saying everything's great now, and there are other people saying, no, everything's terrible now. And there's some reasons behind that. So that was very interesting for me. One thing I could not understand is why is no one suspecting the exemplars or the oracles or the archmages of being behind the Rogue Council? The Rogue Council can put out all these messages to powerful mage players that are untraceable. They are really, really good at staying hidden. They must have, some kind of powerful abilities. Why is nobody saying, I wonder if that's the oracles. I wonder if that's the exemplars or the archmages. It's just not even mentioned in the book. And I can sort of understand. Revised Edition doesn't want to focus on those powerful players so much. They want to set a stage where starting out playing characters can be more influential. But still, it just seems like at least at one point in the book, they should have at least mentioned that, or at least had a reason why that can't be the case. And I want to finish on one note. This book says that when the Rogue Council sends out messages, those messages are just untraceable. And it doesn't give rules for that. There's no game mechanics. It just says they are untraceable. And yeah, there's a reason for that. I'm not upset about it. But this is an example of storyteller fiat. And so my question to all of our listeners is that reasonable? Or is that unreasonable? Is that a storyteller taking too much power and cutting out player initiative? Or is that a reasonable thing to do? I mean, should we have the rules involved in tracing Rogue Council messages so that somebody who has a powerful enough wonder or enough skills can do it? Or is it reasonable to just say, no, you can't do that? That my story depends on you not doing that. So let's take it forward. So those of you listening to the podcast, you guys can discuss that on your own. If you feel really, really strongly about it, just remember, don't attack Terry and I. We're just the messengers.
Bring it.
It wasn't our idea.
Yeah. These messages may have no resonance or feelings, but we do, so be gentle. I thought it was interesting because it made Mage weird again. Like the flip side of the very intimate personal notion of Revised that we also got through a bunch of the tradition books of there being a lot of self-reflection is kind of being like, yeah, there's a lot of people that are trying to figure out their role in the universe. In the meantime, there are sentient avatar shards who are trying to reshape creation in their own image. And you're like, oh, okay, that's good that we got both sides of it. I appreciated that. The untraceability, I am ambivalent about that kind of hand waving, like, and ambivalent in the traditional sense of I feel very strongly in favor of it sometimes and very strongly opposed to it sometimes. This book throws out a lot of possible red herrings, and like, I don't know about your experience with being a storyteller. The players are the red herrings. They don't need anything to distract them. So if I were like, yeah, the Sphinx is a guy by the name of Larry who lives in a suburb of Burbank, California, they would be like, that's what you want us to think, person whose story this is. So we'll find the truth. And you're like, people are idiots. So it's real big on like, these things to throw you off the trail. Like, that just does not fit with my storytelling style. That is me. I think there have been some innovations in how to tell multi-layer mystery stories in RPGs, like one being the iceberg method, where Mage frequently runs into a problem where the right effect with the right number of successes will immediately solve the problem. The same way that like in any Star Trek game where you need to pick up an object, it immediately becomes a question of, okay, so we teleport in, grab the thing, and then teleport out. Oh, no. There's a ionic dampening field in play. Oh, okay, yeah, there's always an ionic dampening field or something like that. And there are just different ways to build a story so that you don't have to be in that position. And one is the iceberg method. This is something I discovered when I was reading City of Mist, which is a different RPG that basically says the key is to have layers of the mystery be seemingly untied to each other. There is no direct thread that traces it from mysterious object back to ultimate source at the top of the pyramid of satanic power or what have you. It has to go through certain intermediary steps, and there's simply no way to trace it from beginning to end, which I like as an idea. So I think there is some work that has occurred in the RPG industry between then and now that if this were to be brought into Mage now, that maybe it would be presented a little bit differently. It creates a wide-ranging thing that the storyteller is going to need to like piece together. There's a lot of bits that you would need to keep track of, especially if you have bits of information from all over the place. You never know what a player is going to grab onto, and suddenly you need to have information about it and a lot of background information about the awakened world. It suggests a world where there's like a lot of mages running around and only a certain number are ever in communication with each other at a certain time. That's strictly a feeling I have. It's not like it gives numbers. It very much feels almost like a werewolf book in that the things in the world are personifications of giant themes, and that you are not going up against the technocracy per se. You are going up against the idea of control. And that's a way of taking it. Maybe that's me overreading the werewolf guy being the Mage line developer at the time, but that to me is a subtle shift. And all of those things are fine. They are merely observations I have about where it feels like if this book were to be continued for another 20 books, where the line may go. I am curious to see if there is a shift in, for instance, how the tradition books are presented. Because up until now, the tradition books that we got in revised are generally more contemplative. They show a wider mage world. It tends to include more social and ethnic groups compared to maybe what we saw in first and second edition. And it shows a lot of traditions dealing with their past baggage of dealing with ramifications of previous choices. So I'm curious to see if any of those things change. We're alphabetically only up to, Hollor/Euthanatoi. So we have a bunch more tradition books to go through. So I'll be kind of curious to see where it goes from here. But on the whole, it's a relatively high energy book that makes the world of mages strange again, and it doesn't bang on about vampires or werewolves or anything else to do it. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah.
I'd like more information about Situation 6. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, I think the only other thing to bring up would be the treatment of the Technocracy in this book. Of course, in first edition, Technocracy was the main villain. In second edition, it was a villain. In Heinig's revised edition, the Technocracy is specifically states in the Storyteller's Handbook that no, the Technocracy are not villains. They are just players on the field. It's not right to think of them as being good guys or bad guys. And in this book, we're back to the earlier mage point of view, which is, no, the Technocracy are the bad guys. There is a reasonable reason to oppose them. And, of course, storytellers can do whatever they like. The Technocracy has been presented so many different ways in published mage books. But it's just interesting to note that now that we have a new developer at the helm, that we're taking this different view of the Technocracy. Well, now that we're coming to the end, I don't have any adventure ideas today, but, there was a quote that just jumped off the page to me. Page 33, quote, "Belief feeds on itself," end quote. That just really got me thinking, like, wow, yeah. I need some more time to think that one through, but it is interesting. How about you, Terry? Any quotes stood out?
Yes. Early on, when it's talking about the different Sphinx conspiracies, it says the word Sphinx comes from the Greek sphingo, meaning to strangle, or sphigein, meaning to bind tightly. The Sphinx of the Greeks strangle those who could not answer its riddles, and those who weren't smart enough, wise enough, or enlightened enough to solve its mystery. I was curious about it, and I looked into it, and the origin of Sphinx is also the same root as the word sphincter, which suggests a different origin. The Sphinx is an asshole.
My gosh, not only did you suggest it, you proved it.
Yes. And also towards the end, when it's outlining our Nazi scientist, it says, "He will not under any circumstances be allowed a Kurdeman duel." And I'm like, wow, you're really banging on about the Kurdeman here. Alois Richter is still a dangerous psychopath, living proof that the Awakened are capable of pure evil without one whit of nephondic influence. Thank you. Thank you. Can we put that on a billboard? That everyone can be a bad guy and you don't have to be a Nephondi to do it. So, yeah, those were two things that I thought are important to take out into the world. Sphinxes are assholes, and people who aren't the Nephondi can be bad people. So what are we reading next, Adam?
Next up, we're going to look at The Fallen Tower, Las Vegas, which is the first city book I think we get.
And last, but
possibly,
who cares?
yeah, I think I was going to say possibly the only city book we get in Mage. And of course, city books are very important in Vampire, not so much in Mage. But I'm just curious to see what we're going to get. I've been to Las Vegas a couple of times. I'm certainly no expert on the city, but I just never thought of using it in a Mage game. I'd like to see what the book has to offer.
Yeah.
Well, if you have something to say, please contact us at magethepodcast@gmail.com with your questions, comments, or feedback. Subscribe to Mage the Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, and other aggregators. If you liked the show, others might like it too. If you leave a positive review for Mage the Podcast, it makes us show up much more easily in other people's searches. You can follow us on Twitter at Mage the Podcast. We're also on the web at magethepodcast.com. You can listen to past shows, get the full show notes there, and see what we're up to. Well, this episode is thanks to executive producers John Magnuson, Isabel Castillo-Lopez, Michael Krettel, Ira Grace, Richard Batt Brewster, Michael Parker, Christopher Phillips, Ilara J. Sunsern, Bryce Perry, William Martin, John Horton, William Connolly, Brandon Morrill, Andrew Kotz, Jenna F., Andrew Edelstein, Chris Sack, Joshua Golden, Dan Svensson, Andy, Neil Patterson, Buck Farmer, Freddie, Anders, and Justin. If you would like to become an executive producer for Mage the Podcast, it would help us keep the lights on and keep bringing you episodes like this one. You would also become a part of our own council to discuss upcoming projects. The link in the show notes will get you started. Well, thanks everyone for listening. Until next time, truth until paradox, baby.
33 more books and we're done with this. Stay classy. Bye.